Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on philosophy, logic, and Islamic thought, and in particular my favorite of the Islamic philosophers, Avicenna. So Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, Ibnsina, as with Chinese philosophers, you can Google and Wikipedia these names, and they will tell you the Latinized and the transliterated into English and the Romance languages versions of the names that are current, and then in brackets the past or past identified names with these people. So Ibn Sina has been known in Europe as Avicenna, and I will continue to consistently call him Avicenna. In the same way that I consistently call Confucius Confucius, even though his name is technically Confucius. Many people have known him since the 1600s as Confucius and have known Ibn Sina in Europe as Avicenna for longer. In fact, Avicenna had a very particular and powerful impact on European thought that still goes, I would say, largely unrecognized because, for the simple reason that, like all cultures, we are definitely celebrating what we perceive to be our lineage, and Avicenna, oddly, even though in the Abrahamics as a Muslim, falls outside of that, even though the Muslims, as I already have ranted and raved about and like to do, had a significant impact, and Avicenna in particular and centrally, on Europe and European thought, philosophy, science, and many other things. So Ibn Sina lived from 980 to 1037. So actually, midway between us and Jesus. His name, again, was Latinized by Christian Europeans as Avicenna, and he is often called the greatest of the Islamic philosophers, much as Plato is the most popular and extensive, and thus the greatest, quote, quote, in influence of the Greek philosophers, Confucius of the Chinese philosophers, Buddha, one could say, even though not a Hindu, in fact an unorthodox non-Hindu Indian, Nepalese, what have you, Buddha of the Indian philosophers, and Kant for German philosophers. Even though I am not the biggest fan, I know much about Plato and Kant, I'm not the biggest Platonist nor Kantian, but each of these figures was, in a certain sense, the most influential, whether or not people were influenced as for or against them, in that they were known, they were popular, they were good at their game, and a lot of people liked and disliked them and talked a lot about them. So Avicenna is in many ways the guy who gathers what's before him, becomes someone amazing, and then is reacted to positively and negatively, most notably by Averroes, Ibn Rushd, who we will have next in the next talk. Like Plato, he gathered a lot. In fact, if you see my talks on Plato, he gathers up pretty much Plato's dialogues, gathering up and going through and talking through the thinking of those before him, and then saying, please come to my grad school, and then others react, like Aristotle and others, for and against Plato and Platonism. So Avicenna is, again, like these other figures, possibly the most influential of the Islamic philosophers and logicians. He was a doctor, a logician, and a philosopher, as well as filling many other roles and wearing other hats. Such that a lot of courses in anything like Islamic thought, if you can find a course in Islamic philosophy, much of it would be taught like a Greek philosophy course. However, they are or aren't taught that you would teach it up to and then following Plato, somewhat as Whitehead said. So, and Islamic scholars themselves would somewhat, and I am not the greatest expert on this, I'm not a great expert at all on this, but not an expert even, lousy or otherwise. So, Islamic scholars, though, have celebrated Avicenna enough that much of it, like with Plato, is taught up to and then after him, whether or not, as an Islamic scholar, you support Avicenna or those of his critics and detractors. And keep in mind, Chinese thought and Islamic thought is full of just as much diversity of schools of thought and perspectives as anything Western, like in Greece or Europe. This is something, again, that I think is a misperception of people, but then again, it is a misperception of civilized peoples and tribes all over that they think and others don't, and then when you look into it, actually they have many thinkers with many different positions. We can learn from all of it, and then you can judge everybody however you do. I can't stop you. Reach in your head. Confucius says that about the humblest of people. So Islamic logic, in fact, and debate somewhat obviously began on the street and everywhere else, streets having been invented, thousands of years earlier in that area somewhat, that Islamic logic began in Islamic courts of law from the beginning. But by the year 1000, largely thanks to Farabi and Avicenna, please see my talk about Farabi, he is the major figure forerunner of Avicenna. In fact, if we are going to do talks here simply on the big three, Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes, that thanks to Farabi and Avicenna, Aristotelian peripatetic logic, they were into Aristotle, Farabi and Avicenna, see my Farabi, was the dominant tradition of logic to show strengths and faults in arguments, using the organon, the tool, which was it's actually, the organon was gathered earlier than these by, I believe, by folks before these figures. I want to be cautious about saying exactly who. But the tool of Aristotle is used along with many other, I am sure, guides, etc., but is a dominant force and a dominant set of texts in understanding how reasoning works. By 1100, Avicenna had taken Aristotle's place as his superior. Because Avicenna does not agree with Aristotle entirely. Many Europeans have said, and unfortunately I have read in books authored decades past, a few whippings past, in the English, that many of these, Hegel says earlier in German, well, these are just placeholders holding on to Aristotle for us. Well, no, actually, Farabi thinks Aristotle, he is the guy bringing Aristotle, as I argued, and as is pretty much been the opinion of everyone, so I don't really have to argue it, I can just rely on others. Avicenna is criticizing Aristotle, taking Aristotle, using him, but then also, like Aristotle did to Plato, Aristotle is very much the Platonist. Many have argued he isn't. He very much is. Avicenna is very much the Aristotelian, but then saying Aristotle is wrong and criticizing him and becoming the central Islamic philosopher, criticizing Aristotle and going beyond him. You then have Europeans after these Islamic philosophers who are in the modern European tradition. I've been teaching modern European thought this semester as well as logic, and this is a logic lecture. I think I will specifically include it in my modern European talks as a preface next time I teach, probably in a year, the modern European stuff. That's, you have then European philosophers going past the Greeks. They don't simply extend their theories as Aristotelians or Platonists, because even though Christian thought was very Aristotelian and Platonist before and then after, these Islamic philosophers and logicians were a powerful force in Europe and, Eurasia, Africa. Usually heard it said Eurasia, not Eurasia, Africa, altogether. It's like, why not? It has been the whole thing, of course. It's not like it formed recently that way, as far as I understand the drift. If you get my drift. Yes, it's quite tectonic a point. So, or not really a point, more round than that. But Islamic logic, again, it was very Aristotelian, but Avicenna was already talking well past Aristotle, as I already have. While Averroes turned back to Aristotle, then the third major thinker, so you have Farabi first and foremost, says Aristotle. Avicenna next says yes, but also no. And then you have Averroes, the third, says no, more Aristotle, more kind of concretely, materially, you could say then ideally. Avicenna says no, more idealistic than Aristotle, and he prefigures, I would say, German idealism and British empiricism in being more, no, it's concepts of the mind. I have very Wittgensteinian thoughts on that, I've already shared. But that it is very much in the mind what horses are, not just physically horses in the world. Then that is the example I will give and explain very soon here. And then Averroes says, no, as I'll explain afterwards with the next talk. He says, no, it's more the physical group of horses, not your idea of horses. And that is a very interesting realist-idealist sort of debate that they have around and with and then beyond Aristotle. And Averroes was also not simply trying to be an unquestioning Aristotelian. He was trying to have his own thinking after Aristotle, Farabi, Avicenna, and others, Al-Ghazali, etc. So Averroes turned back to Aristotle from Avicenna, and Europeans more so followed him, in fact. Averroes was more so the relied-upon thinker of Europe, of the Islamic world, but Avicenna was more important, and Europeans knew well of him, and actually of his medicine as a doctor, as well as his philosophy, as well as his logic, and yet they liked the more traditional, sort of materialistic, one could say, although those are improper words to use in the ancient world and medieval world in a sense, but they are becoming something more like that here. There's something more like, no, it's just realist what it is versus, well, it's shaped by my mind to be what it is in my mind. Idealism, psychology in the mind versus simply out in the world. And then you have theories about correspondence between these different things that people still argue about, in fact, and I try to do Wittgensteinian thinking about and through. So, Avicenna is not the most popular to Europe, but he is in the Islamic world, and he is very popular enough in Europe anyways. And Averroes actually then went on to become more popular in Europe than he ever was in the Islamic world, according to some. So, let us get into Avicenna's life, and then we will get into examples of Avicenna's thought, in paying a particular note to, of course, logic and epistemology. Avicenna was born in the village of Afshana in what is today Uzbekistan. His father, the governor of a larger nearby village they didn't live in, which is an interesting strategy employed today in D.C., it would seem. Guys, speaking of D.C., don't fight. I'm breaking up a fight of my cats. So yes, it's somewhat like, like Washington crossing some kind of endless river. So as a boy, Avicenna is said to have learned Indian arithmetic from an Indian grocer in his neighborhood. I would love someday to create a cartoon, or see one created, in which there's an Indian grocer. Unfortunately, I do, and many would think of The Simpsons and Apu, who is not simply the representative of the Indian community, of course, and I have Indian friends who have laughed at and hated also Apu. Different people and at different, times of the day. So, as a boy, again, I would love to see Avicenna as a boy, as an Uzbeki boy, is learning from an Indian in a grocery store, what have you, and learning basics of Indian numerals, of course, become Arabic numerals. They were at the time. Avicenna is one of the people to help with that. And at this time, actually, around this time, the Pope had declared 0 to be satanic and heretical, in fact, actually in a papal bull, believe it or not. I don't know the year on that. In fact, I think that happened just before Avicenna was born. And the Indians have the concept of 0. And then algebra picks up with the Indian Arabic numerals and Indian variables, X's, heavy dots to be resolved later. Avicenna read all the Greek philosophy he could find, boiled it down in his notes to the essential points, and then rearranged the points into coherent arguments as he could. So he was doing commentaries and making his own notes and commentaries on the works of Aristotle and others, which is pretty much what Aristotle's works may actually be in the hands of his students' notes. And he produced vast commentaries on many subjects as needed. Keep in mind also that the Europeans had almost, you can see between 1400 and 1500, the Europeans get very into having Greeks and texts, and the Vatican Library does, and I've noted that in other places, that the Vatican Library gets very into Greek texts between 1400 and 1500. And here we have Avicenna around the year 1000 learning as a child as much Greek text as he could because they were more available in the Islamic world at the time. So after this, he claims to have learned nothing after the age of 18. Isn't that what every 18-year-old would say, though? Having read all the texts he could by then, and then maturing year by year as he thought over what he had learned. Avicenna is said to be the foremost doctor of his time, and his canon of medicine, translated into Latin like his name, was used as a textbook for Europeans up until the 1700s, as Europe passed the Islamic world in power. In fact, it is very much, as I like to say, not only 1400 to 1500, the Vatican Library is the biggest library in Europe, gets into Greek books, and has more than 12. The Europeans very much between 1600 and 1700 had more money and power than the Islamic world. That's something that I constantly bring up because people are like 1492. Yes, and that is actually the Spanish and Portuguese retaking as Christian kings and queens and then going to, Portugal, Spain and then Portugal and then going. And then there's the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions following, unfortunately. That you have all of that as Europe is rising, but then it is 1700. That's the safe point to say that Europe is then somewhat beyond the Islamic world and then continues to stretch that ways, and we live in this situation now. And that is actually just worth mentioning. Again, Europe did, Islam expanded into the world, took some of Europe and Africa and Asia, and was the largest contiguous empire, the largest stretch of land and empire the world had and has ever seen, and then, in a certain sense, I mean continuous land, and then actually the Europeans taking a lot of that technology and civilization, etc., then took that and got quite colonial, and in a certain sense took the Americas and Africa more so than anybody had, and now people are worried about China and East Asia getting in on the action in Africa and South and the Americas, and Europeans in Europe and America and the Americas are worried back and forth about all that. That is very much the situation of power from then till now, and worth noting again as an aside here. So back to, though, Avicenna, his medical practice and his work on medicine, which was highly influential and well known to be, at least for those who check, that his medical practices, other than my speech patterns, were based on experimentation and clinical trials, as Al-Kindi endorses, fusing Persian, Greek, Indian, and other medical traditions together. He hypothesized that diseases are caused by microscopic organisms. Now, the Jains actually do believe in India that there are tiny, tiny organisms, and in fact, many cultures believe there's tiny, tiny little things. But the Jains actually do believe there's tiny, good and bad karmic, tiny little creatures that get into you and then cause problems when you eat things. And those are physical beings that are very tiny. That may or may not have influenced Avicenna, I have to say. I just know that through the Indian thought. But he is closer, of course, to modern times, and his medicine directly may have relied and is fusing Indian sources together. He likely knew who the Jains were, I am almost certain, and I am not absolutely positive, but he may have known of these theories. I would have to chase that down more specifically, I have to say, but for myself. But that is, of course, hypothesizing that in ways and putting forward those theories that then influence Europe. He was into randomized control trials. This is the kind of thing, again, where a lot of people think, well, logic hadn't taken until Greece came to Europe again. And, of course, people are doing everything they can available as they think it out with the best of thought, and sometimes those are only a few who are positioned well and talented, etc. But he is doing randomized control trials in order to see whether or not what he is doing is working well, because that is a stopgap you would think up. As well as he invented terms for hallucinations, insomnia, mania, dementia, epilepsy, and syndromes. Keep in mind also, as I like to say, a lot of people misunderstand the ancient world as believing in the immaterial and the modern world believing in the material. It is more that the ancient world believed in the spiritual material, and it's all fire and air and the various levels of physics in certain ways, and I do always push this point against those who argue otherwise. And then it is more in the modern era that all of that becomes mere spirits, and therefore that's not real material science. And that actually has, I think, bent people towards the unfortunate and incorrect view that ancient people didn't believe in materialism, when in fact the material was spiritual for them, I think is a better way. That's my interpretation. I am perfectly happy to say there's different cultures that do things differently, but it isn't really immaterial nonsense and illogical. I argue that all the time. I have to bring it up again here. This is, again, a lot of people might say, how did he think up these things so early before modern medicine? It's like, because it was logical, rational medicine and shamans and this guy and everyone the whole time, and they didn't have modern technologies, of course, but they're getting there with these folks. So Avicenna was apparently the first to correctly show the workings of the eye, arguing that light does not emanate from the mind and through the eyes in perception, as we do not see in the dark. I always think of the Looney Tunes and Simpsons' eyes in the dark. And through the eyes in perception, you don't find light shooting out, as like Superman laser or a Cyclops of the X-Men. We do not see in the dark, but rather light goes into the eye from outside, contradicting Aristotle, in fact. And Aristotle is wrong about several things. The acceleration of objects falling downward, several other things that then Newton corrects that. There's others, again, who have come along and said, well, Aristotle's great and these other people are great, and that is how knowledge and theory, science, philosophy proceed. Art, paradigms, examples, good and bad. Avicenna was an essential author for understanding Aristotle in scientific investigation, even as he argued against Aristotle on many points, like as so. Avicenna claims to use intuition, Hads, H-A-D-S, as transliterated, to judge Aristotle and the Peripatetics and say whether or not they should have come to other conclusions or not. Now, judgment, talking, is all sort of associated logicking, reasoning in other languages, cultures, and we have to make such judgment calls to transliterate it into and translate into English. Again, it often has to do with seeing, judging, talking, something like that is logicking, reasoning, thinking things out, talking things out, feeling things out altogether, I would say, and I do say that loosely on purpose. So Avicenna reinterpreted sections of Aristotle's prior analytics and on interpretation. I've talked a lot about those, two central books of the Organon, and this took the place of Farabi's faithful Aristotle as the dominant theory of Islamic logic and philosophy. His own commentaries take the place of Aristotle's work, and interest fell away from the others. The Shamsiyya of al-Khatibi, I am sure I'm mispronouncing Shamsiyya because there's two Y's in it. I don't know how to say that. One of the most popular logic textbooks in human history, focuses on formal questions of Avicenna on these topics. By the way, I have to say you can very clearly see that all these names are not in spell check. I mean, Avicenna nor Ibn Sina are in spell check. And every time I change computers, there's little wavy red lines under everything. And this is all, ancient as in hundreds of years ago history. Not ancient. I mean, I call it sort of middle medieval because I still sort of say ancient, somewhat middle, onward modern, just to conveniently point at large periods of history, which is, some say, foolish. But again, these names are not in spell check. So again, and I don't know how to pronounce the double Y here, I admit. For Avicenna, intention or meaning is matnan, M-A-N-A-N, an idea, the form or essence apprehended by the soul or mind, consciousness. Much as we understand images, we see to have meaning beyond the image involved with its form, as well as universal concepts and categories. We think. Again, I like the Wittgensteinian arguments against this, which means things grasping necessity of being or not, beyond the thing perceived. We get the word intention in English from the Latin intentio, which was used to translate non into the Latin. So intent and intentionality is a very major topic in American analytic philosophy still, and in European and modern European thought very much, and psychology. Intention, intentionality, how to intend things. Again, I think a Wittgensteinian picture basically tells us it is very much sensation, emotion, motive, and verbalization all intertwined, and I think that's a simpler, better picture and model for it, and I think that's what Wittgenstein's later thinking is pushing towards. But what is intention and what form does it take? Takes many forms, and people argue a lot about that. I think that those words are helpful to talk about what is an intention. Well, it would be something like there's things and living people and beings, etc. There's motives about it, and then people are talking and acting about those things all intertwined. But then what is the intention and where is it and how is it? Then, of course, gets very interesting in many thinkers' thinking, as it was in Avicenna's. As the Mad Hatter tells Alice, we really should say what we mean. I'm screwing this up. And mean what we say. Verbalization and motive, at least. And there's usually things. This is essence and existence, the mental intent and verbal form, meaning and saying together. Following Aristotle, Avicenna says there are many ways we grasp things as abstractions, as meanings, such as perception, in which we see color and form with the eye, common sense, imagination, memory, and the highest, intellect. Now, I like to show that I do think that people put a totem pole of these faculties and try to put highest and lowest. That's very Aristotle, passion to substance and truth above. I think it would be better to see this as, and it's very Wittgensteinian to see this as a more lateral, not unilateral, that word is very meaningless and silly. Something like a network of diverse elements, not a totem pole from down to up, but in that sense, again, we could be very visually dominant creatures. That doesn't mean by sight, as opposed to emotion, we do everything, or that that's central in each thought. So it's not clear if we call reasoning, it is not clear if what we call reasoning is common sense, intellect, or some combination of these, along with the others. But understanding is grasping things in these ways. The Greek doctor Galen located these in the brain, as did his followers, while others, such as Farabi, located them in the heart, following Aristotle. You will find me sometimes confused about that. The Greeks sometimes do talk as if things are in the head or in the heart. You do have the higher senses and a higher soul sort of up in the head for Plato and Aristotle, but at the same time, Aristotle does talk as if the heart, very much like Confucius and the Chinese, is also confusingly the center of the human being. And I don't know if modern scholars have ironed all that out perfectly, but Galen at least located these more in the brain, whereas I believe Aristotle thought the brain was simply a blood cooling mechanism or something like that. And the eyes are up there, but you feel more so, or your more central life is right here. Avicenna thinks that imagination as highest intellect is always active when we are awake, and our minds wander or asleep, and our minds wander and asleep, and our minds dream. My notes are confusing. Our minds wander, sleep, and dream, but we can direct the wandering mind by placing it under the intellect, which is thinking, which involves the analysis and synthesis of splitting things apart and putting things together, of syllogistic Aristotelian reasoning. So again, this fits with much of European logic to follow. Avicenna argues a sheep can see, smell, hear, and, if unlucky, touch a wolf with external senses. He actually says all this with, I think, a sense of humor, suggestively to the audience, and we all think and expect, which is all fed from the senses into fantasia, common sense. Now that is, many would say, oh, fantasy. He's saying that fantasy is reality. Whoa, that's terrible. No, he means imagination is how you reason. He's actually putting visual reasoning up here with the Platonists and the Aristotelians. Even as we were just talking about things are rooted here, the higher senses are up here. And in a certain sense, you have imagination. He's getting a little bit Platonist, and I have heard that argued before. He's getting more Plato than Aristotle, actually, in bringing it back to imagination, because Plato does say, I think my big fat Greek wedding, the woman is the neck, which is not feminism entirely. That basically you have in the totem pole of things that, in a certain sense, imagination and visual thought is way up here for Plato, and he says the neck separates the immortal from the mortal two souls of what is presumably the heart and the stomach. So in that sense, that could be, again, as folks think, a issue between Plato and Aristotle. We don't have recorded transcripts of them talking about it. So Avicenna says a sheep does not have a human intellect, but does grasp intentions. I believe that's true. I think he's right about that. I have cats. They seem to recognize that cats all the time are pretending to do something, and then as soon as I or the other cat does something else, they quickly and knowingly turn back and do what they now know they can do. Now, that could all be built up raw instinct, let's just throw it out there as, and that they're not really thinking. But here again, that may, if we think so simply as the organisms we are and don't try so hard to do it, it does seem like animals, and especially mammals, but perhaps reptiles, even insects, though I'm not going to push that, could grasp intention because it would be a simple experience of experiencing something being like oneself, which is not really verbalized in paragraphs, nor is it conceptualized complexly, you could argue from a Wittgensteinian angle, if it is not complexly verbalized or if you would not even begin to do it. I do like philosophy in the flesh, and some of what Lakoff and Johnson suggest here, that we just have kind of a rough metaphor for self or time, and we don't really grasp them very well. They just kind of are. And we don't really reason about them a lot, which would mean, of course, thinking you have a self or seeing intention or feeling intention in a being or an animal or a cat or a human is not a complex logical thing. It would rather be an element of logicking and reasoning and thinking, but not itself. So Avicenna says the sheep does grasp intentions, as in the wolf. That's a good point. It does seem like a sheep can look at a wolf and, at least in a mammalian way, perhaps even reptilian, lower in the brain and self, and this is a doctor talking, not me, I mean Avicenna, that the wolf, what he can grasp the intention in the sheep can grasp the intention in the wolf, what he calls estimation, wham, not as in wham, and bam, but W-A-H-M, estimation, which is interesting because he is saying intent and estimation, which is motive, but then also sensing motive in others, which are good proto-psychological terms, if not full-on psychological terms. It's just the word psychology is going to be invented several hundred years later. What could also be called concern or care, perception of intentions, which are invisible but can be felt, not seen, smelled, heard, or touched with the outer senses, as well as then woven together in the mind with all of that. And motive, emotion. The sheep cannot see danger, nor the wolf's wrath, but can put it together with a basic sort of sense, Avicenna argues. I do think this is a very Wittgensteinian view, or could be made to be one. I don't think all of Avicenna fits with Wittgenstein. Especially not the oculocentric kind of it's imagination that is the top. Wittgenstein in his early work tried to make a picture of everything and then decided a picture visually of everything is not the deep essence. But that's a slightly different but similar thing. The sheep can put together that the wolf is intending something to it that is threatening and has that sort of sense, and we do too, one could argue, or at least Avicenna seems to suggest there is continuity in creation here, yes? Something in the mind of the sheep adds to the sights and sounds of the wolf. You see people's faces, but you feel something as their motive. And the sheep feels the wolf's motive, and we feel the wolf's motive. The sheep's motive and the wolf and the sheep are actually in our minds. I'm just bringing them up here, and Avicenna is long dead himself. It is not entirely clear in the example if Avicenna means the sheep merely feels the wolf is dangerous, its own fear, or if the sheep feels the wolf's desire, recognizing it as a creature with motives that are threatening instinctively. Avicenna argues that it is basic to the retentive imagination of the sheep, which we share but also have higher inner senses. We could say we actually are very vocal, not unlike but somewhat like parrots. And ultimately, the imagination and intellect and this gives us no clear explanation of where the sheep's fear comes from, either from instinct or conditioning. And that's actually a Wittgensteinian answer, in a certain sense, I have to point out, because he's actually saying we don't know enough, and there's many moments like that at Wittgenstein. We can't know in this simple a game whether or not this is going to go more or less logically, because there isn't that kind of thing here for the sheep. The sheep doesn't target more out to itself necessarily, so it's hard for us to look at the sheep and see situations in which the sheep would make a difference of behavior, such that we can tell the sheep is merely sensing its own fear or the other. I think we can be generous, I would say, and say, well, the sheep has proto-human brain thinking, sort of, in all of this, but again, I just like to be generous in these ways and see some kind of continuity, I would say, in the way Farabi does. As mentioned with Farabi, Islamic philosophers increasingly turn to the human mind and imagination as the source of reality. Think also of the Wittgensteinian thought experiments and how we are very much seeing things to represent them, as well as talking things out with words. Consider that Avicenna, a doctor, was treating patients for hallucinations and dementia, hopefully speech problems for me, while thinking about philosophy and the mind. While Aristotle understood universals, such as the group of all elephants, as a physical set of things, and this brings up the point I was making earlier, Avicenna argued explicitly against Aristotle by name and said that universals are conceptions of the mind, fantasies of sense and imagination. What he is actually saying here, and he does talk like this, the mind dreams in waking life, and we have dreams visually of elephants. I had the good pleasure of studying with Eleanor Roche as an undergraduate in her year-long Buddhist psychology courses that she was offering. I believe there was 2 of them, and I took it back to back. And in all of that, she does say something like that there's a visual prototype, and that's not exactly what Avicenna is saying, but it is something like, no, elephants are more a dream and what you imagine, with the same part of the mind in the brain that you dream of things. You have a dream of elephants, you have a dream of horses, you have a dream of unicorns, and that is your concept, your mental idea of unicorns and elephants, etc. Now, it's very important to mention, as I always like to mention, the Greeks, when they talked about ideas, they're talking about actually very much that as if there's angels or beings above or around that are made of fire and light, and then we take the vision. Platonists were into theophanies, and were very important to the Abrahamic tradition because you have visions of the God, and those are the God's visions the God shares with you, and those are more the ideas. So our minds are very much full of spirits, and that's how we can have concepts in a certain sense for Plato and Aristotle, because they had a more very old school view. You actually have here, you can see this, and I'm not one to say the ancient world, modern world are more or less logical. I actually dissuade people from saying that. I don't think that's what modern psychology or anthropology prove, as I argue already at length. What you actually have here, though, is that he is saying that it's not actually the physical group of horses that is your understanding of horses. It is actually, and I've already said understanding, which actually loads it, doesn't it? It's actually your vision and your dream of horses, which is your concept. Now, I do think he's very right and amazing. I also like the backswing of Wittgenstein against simply ocular-centric or something, but I do appreciate Eleanor Roche and Avicenna very much. And it is how the visual sense interweaves with everything else to be the conceptual, the rational, thought and talk. I prefer the simple words thought and talk. Some people like rational, logical, and they, I guess, try for finer positions with others. So I don't try to do that so much in common talk. I think common talk is best and then making a better point. But, people like syllables. So with all of that, this is, when we speak of elephants, we are talking about the idea and the dream of elephants, not the physical group, although they should be, in a certain sense. Avicenna doesn't say this, but I will say they should be confusing for each other. Let's put it that way. And that's how we think. This is the great debate between essence and existence. It's a bit of existentialism, essentialism, which is a bit Sartre in France much later, but I won't make that hard point right here. Essence and existence is very much Avicenna versus Averroes. Does the term elephant refer to what we are thinking as a dream, or does it more primarily refer to all actual elephants? Now, Averroes goes back against Avicenna and says, Aristotle's right. We know that we are just talking about something that's pointing at and indicating intentionally. My word and my imagination are pointing at the group elephants. But Avicenna uses the example of the unicorn to argue this is wrong. And the unicorn is apparently a Persian animal, various origin, but the unicorn, as our unicorn, I believe, is from the area of Persia, if I may be wrong about that. And so Avicenna is actually talking about a hometown hero animal of sorts as a legend, and he does believe unicorns are imaginary and thus not real, unlike horses, which are also imaginary but real, which is his argument, as we will get to, although we already have the pieces for it already, don't we? Before Avicenna, the Mutazilites, the hardcore rationalists of Islam, had argued that the most general category of thought is the thing, like Farabi says of being. And things can be further divided into existent and non-existent things. Without a thing, there is no subject for words to communicate anything. In the Quran, it says that God merely has to say a non-existent thing to it be, and it is. It's very much in the Old Testament and then consistent in the Quran here. God's imagination is existence. This is very Berkeley. That's the town I'm in right now, except it's mispronounced Berkeley by the folks around hers. So basically, Berkeley says, no, when God imagines something, I want a burrito. Blam! Wham! There is a burrito right there. You know what I mean? I don't know why God would need one as an omnipotent being. I need one as a mortal, lower than all of thou. But at the same time, our imaginations, we are descended from Adam and Eve, so when we have fallen out of the garden, we can imagine a burrito, but then we have to toil to make one. God can just be like, blammo, there's a burrito. Again, as some silly person said, I believe in the 60s, it can, or at some point, I guess, perhaps later, it can, can Jesus microwave a burrito so hot that he, capital H, can't eat it? We don't know. These are all these silly theological paradoxes, of course, that are logical issues, just as silly and serious as anything. And I make fun, and I love, and I kid. With all of this, of course, and whether or not God can contradict God's self, or Jesus can or not, isn't identical with God for the Muslims, of course, and actually says that in Islamic works, because they don't of course, believe in the identity and the Trinity and that. The Mutazilites say God can't contradict God's self. God's like, this is not. Nothing contradicts that. That's reason itself as the imagination, reasoning consciousness of the universe right there, blam. So it is unclear where God finds these non-existents to talk into existence, however, although we'll just leave that beyond us. And the Mutazilites argued with others about whether non-existents are already in the mind of God or not. They actually are talking about God's subconscious almost, like God is a potential imagination beforehand. If so, that would be rather Platonic because the demiurge would take over as not God but secondary so that God can be perfect and unmoving, actually, and would do all the bit as the sort of vizier head servant. So much as all possible universals necessarily exist, but in potency, as the infinite imagination of God, which God can make immediately actual at any time, which is amazing to think about. Do we have science fiction that covers any of this well? No. I have to say, in the 30s and 40s, the French have occasional works about setting things in Sumer or in Babylon in positive ways with positive heroes. You know, maybe we'll get there someday. I don't know. The Mutazilites, like Avicenna, argued that thoughts, mental categories such as horses, are fictional and non-existent, unlike actual horses and physical objects. So thoughts are themselves non-existent, imaginary in the same way. Our concepts are imaginations, imaginary. Remember the ocular-centric, eye-centered thinking here. So the concept of unicorns is mental and non-existent, and so are the unicorns, which also don't exist, unlike horses, but like the idea of them. So we have a dream of horses. That is your concept of horses. We have a dream of unicorns. That's your concept of unicorns. But everyone here is agreeing, Avicenna and the Mutazilites, there are not unicorns. Those aren't real. We don't think, and we do have civilizations before Europe saying, well, we believe in this. We don't believe in that. I think that's heck, John. People in tribes don't know whether or not to trust you when you tell them about the mystical leopards. They actually give you a heck about it because they're people, or not so much because they're people. So with all of that, with culture and all that, and of course tribes don't have it so settled and steady with institutions as much that are and aren't trustworthy thus. But let's leave all that out. So you have this idea of unicorns. That doesn't correspond to real unicorns and objects, but your idea of horses does hook up and point to real physical objects, which very much is kind of a Wittgensteinian bit, if not so ocular-centric, about what the fictional is. It's simply the ideas that we know do not point to existing unicorns or objects. In that sense, as I like to say, and I've already given, people have mentioned with Descartes, and Descartes seems very much Avicenna in ways, I like to argue, that Descartes' reasoning seems to imply God must be real because we can't think of anything better than that, so our ideas must be real. That almost flips it on Adam and Eve, something serious. With all of this, Superman has X-ray vision. Whatever has X-ray vision must be real, you'll grant me, therefore Superman is real and not fiction. That argument seems to make sense at each point, but that would be, because actually Avicenna is saying, no, your concept of Superman or ancient Islamic Superman, medieval Islamic Superman, it's like the anime positively and happily referred to as Chinese electric Batman. I forget which one that is, because there's a Chinese character in the Japanese show. Anyway, the Avicenna here is, well, I've lost my train of thought with Chinese electric Batman, folks, so that's good. Let's continue on. Is consciousness simply imaginary, or does it tend to my verbal train here? Well, not so much. Let's imagine I can go on here. Avicenna argued that the essence of a thing is its definition, what mental categories can properly describe and contain it, but its existence is its individuality, which is not a mental category. Many who followed Avicenna, such as Surawadri, let me say this carefully, Surawardi, my apologies, who died, I don't know when he was born from sources, in 1191, he argued essence is primary, superior to objects. So actually the imagination, that's very idealist, proto-idealist. While others, such as Mulla Sadra, who died in 1640, argued essence is a secondary mental construct. Notice he is dying in mid-1600s. That's around the time of Newton, and between 1600 and 1700 is Europe and Islam fighting, and then Europe getting money and power and colonialism, etc. So whether or not they took the side of Avicenna, whatever it may be, most Islamic philosophers and many Christian Europeans argued in terms Avicenna himself very well framed post-Aristotelian, as Aristotelian thought. Even as many, but not all Christian European philosophers then preferred traditional Aristotle and Averroes to Avicenna, who is the one following Avicenna, so he speaks like him and against him. Sartre, the French founder of existentialism in the 1940s, argued that existence precedes essence, not the other way around. I have a quote here in the notes. What do we mean by saying that existence precedes essence? We mean that man, first of all, exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself, we could say in words, afterward. So that idea I do like decently. I'm not the biggest Sartrean, who knows? What he means is very different from Avicenna, though, that we make meaning, which is secondary to physical, disorganized and illogical existence, actually daily life. Now, Avicenna would say yes, and then that is correct insofar as it is in tune with the mind of God. Sartre, of course, is a post-Nietzschean French thinker who is rather anarchistic and agnostic, not necessarily, well, Sartre actually was more the hard communist, more hard atheist. So he is actually saying, no, we in our minds make the world as individual humanity, one at a time. It's not whether or not it is in touch with science and or gods and or what have you. Although I have to say, as the hard communist, he then not only is kind of Cartesian, he also then is oddly into objectivity in the name of communism and science, which I think doesn't, well, I don't know. For me, it's not entirely consistent. But then again, I'm not a Sartrean, whatever. All of this may seem strange, not only my words, for a thing to not exist is particularly what it is yet. But of course, if you think that we have ideas of unicorns and horses and we don't meet many horses and no unicorns all day, you understand. Consider possibilities and potentialities don't exist but do as far as we think about them. That is very Hegel after Avicenna. Consider somebody's thinking of opening a door of one or two and can't do both. And I have talked about possibilities in such ways already extensively. Potentials, again, for Hegel and others, are in fact, of course, in certain ways, they're open-ended. Avicenna's floating man thought experiment should be important and included in any intro philosophy class because it is strikingly similar to Descartes' deceiving demon, one of the first major concepts of modern European philosophy. Avicenna, who worked with anesthetics in hospitals such as opium, asks us to imagine that we are slowly unable to feel our feet, then our body, then sight and sensation. The memory and imagination knows us going upward, up the totem pole. What is left, the last and most essential thing that is ourselves, the highest, thus descended from itself? Avicenna replies, it is consciousness, our awareness of existing even if we cannot think of who or what we are. Even if, I like to say, you don't know that you're 3.5 red squares or yourself with a name, you would still be aware, but not even that you're a singular thing, but there would be awareness, let's say, much like there is love in that song. With that, we can still be said to exist. In a certain sense, many would agree this is very Locke continuity of consciousness before Locke and the thought experiment of the switching of the people with the brains that I get into with Locke. Many would say even if some, and this would be why if somebody has great dementia or Alzheimer's, in one way, and I mentioned with Locke, we would say they no longer are the person they were, but in a certain sense, they are the consciousness that they were since they were a child, which makes the teleporters of Star Trek actually highly questionable. But we'll leave all that to you checking out the Locke thing if you want to. Without that, it can be said that we are no longer there. If we are no longer conscious, then we're no longer there, even if we're a robot that seems to remember and repeat its name. Descartes has us imagine that there is a demon who is deceiving us and creating the world as an illusion, but the one thing the demon cannot trick us about is that we are aware. Descartes concludes his argument with the famous declaration, I think, therefore I am. Though it would be more accurate, and Nietzsche says he's smuggling in thinking where there just should be awareness. It would be more accurate thus, and following Nietzsche, I have to say, for him to say, I am aware, therefore I am. Because he then says, so logically God has to exist in science and math and stuff, the most certain of our thinking. And he gets that just out of bare animal awareness, which he does not think is bare animal awareness. In fact, he thinks animals, unlike humans, are not conscious and are not aware. But we will leave that to Descartes. Where does this deceiving demon come from? Well, oddly enough, this is because of the Cathars, who are Gnostic Manichaeans in France. I talk more about that with Descartes. And actually, all of that is mixed up with Abrahamic strains that weren't as dominant as Islam and Christianity and Judaism, and major strains of that, but major strains of Abrahamic Eurasian African thought, which actually are interwoven with various factions in Islam, the Christian world, etc. So with all that, hopefully you enjoyed this about Avicenna and the unicorn. Please leave me happy, helpful questions or comments in the comments. Please feel free to ask me questions about all of that. I am passionate about not only arguing for, but against you. And with all this, I will, as always, see ya. Ocular centrism, very eye-centered here. Though this isn't an eye center, nor a clinic of kinds. I will see ya, if I ever do manage to see ya.